As an author of woodland fiction for children and young adults, I often try to think of stories that I can orient to different grade levels. And years ago, I lived in this old farmhouse in upstate New York, not far from where I live now. There was a big pond by the house, and in the spring when the frogs would all come out, it kind of prompted me to write this story for young readers. And I'd like to share it with you. The story is called Frog Feathers, and the story goes like this. Once, upon a pond, it was a beautiful spring morning. The cattails were blowing in the wind, little rivulets of waves were moving across the top of the pond, and over by the shore, in the shallow water, there were two frogs. They were leopard frogs. One was about the size of a fist. The other was much smaller, but when it grew up, it wanted to be just like the big frog. They were leopard frogs because they had big spots on their bodies that made them look like leopards. As the two frogs were in the water, the big frog with its big eyes looking up above the edge of the pond, it called, "Dirt!" And the little frog, who wanted to be just like the big frog when he grew up, he said, "Dirt." And then the big frog said, "Dirt." And the little frog, he said, "Dirt." And then he said, excuse me, do you think we're going to get something to eat pretty soon? I don't know about you, but I'm starved." And that's when the big frog said, "Hush up. We can't hunt in Jabber 2. Be quiet." Well, the little frog, he wanted to do as the big frog had told him. So he sat there looking around. But when he looked up, he could see all kinds of flying insects flying in front of his face. There were dragonflies, mayflies, damselflies, regular flies. He wanted to open up his froggy mouth, throw out his long sticky tongue, and catch some of those flying insects, because he was a frog. That's what he ate. But he said to himself, not me. I'm going to be a good little frog. I'm going to sit right here, be nice and quiet, just like the big frog told me to. Dirt! Well, he didn't mean to say it. It just popped out. Well, the big frog, he turned. He scowled. He scowled at that little frog, and then that big frog, he took one of his flippers and he kicked that little frog right in the belly. But when the big frog kicked the little frog in the belly, it made the little frog take in a great big mouthful of water. So then when the little frog went to tell the big frog that he had not meant to say dirt, that it had just popped out, when he opened his mouth to talk, the mouthful of water squirt out. It sailed through the air. And when the big frog turned to scowl at the little frog, the big mouthful of water came sailing through the air, and it hit the big frog right in the face. Well, the little frog, he quickly turned around and pretended to be a serious hunter of flies and mosquitoes. But that is when a mother quail, a beautiful ground-feeding bird with beautiful shades of brown and white feathers on her wings and breast, and with a short, stout beak for looking for seeds in the grass, she was bringing her baby chicks down through the grass, down toward the pond. And as the mother quail came down through the grass, she stopped and she turned to her babies and she said, "Look, stay here. I'm going down to the pond to see if it is safe for you to take a bath and to get a drink of water. Stay here. Be quiet. I'll be right back." And so the mother quail went down toward the shore of the pond. Well, the big frog with his big eyes, he saw the mother quail coming through the grass. And so the big frog turned to the little frog, and the big frog said, "Get down! Get down!" So the two frogs sank down below the surface of the water. When the mother quail came to the edge of the water, being a bird that looked out of each eye separately from the other, with one eye she checked the bank for safety on one side. With her other eye she checked the bank for safety on the other side. But she did not see the big eyes of the frog that were watching her from under the shallow water. So the mother quail, she turned back to go and get her babies. And that's when the two frogs came back up to the surface. And the big frog said, "All right." When that mother bird brings those baby chicks down to the water to take a bath and to get a drink, I'm going to get one of those baby chicks and I'm going to eat it for my supper. The little frog, who had been watching and listening, the little frog said, "Excuse me. Excuse me. Whenever I ask you if frogs eat birds, you always say, 'No.'" And the big frog said, "That's right. Frogs don't eat birds." And the little frog, he scratched his head quizzically with his flipper and he said, "Well, wait a minute. If frogs don't eat birds, how come you're going to eat a bird now? I'm a frog too, and I can't." And the big frog said, "Hush up. Be quiet. You ask too many questions." So the two frogs sank down below the surface of the pond. The mother quail, she brought her babies down to the edge of the water, and then, being birds, to take a bath, they stepped into the shallow water. But the youngest of the brothers and sisters, he had to go in the deepest. He pushed himself right by his bigger brothers and sisters. And then, being birds in the water, they flapped their wings and they splashed, and the water splashed into the air, and they splashed water under their feathers, and they preened their feathers with their beaks. And the little chick, who had to go in the deepest, he was having so much fun, he never saw the big eyes of the frog that were moving closer under the water. And one time the little chick, he was enjoying himself so much, he splashed that water vigorously with his wings, and when he did, one drop of water splashed up off the surface of the pond. The drop of water sailed up, and the drop of water came down and landed right on the end of the little bird's beak. And when the little bird looked down at the end of his beak, that's when the big frog broke through the surface of the pond. The big frog opened his mouth as wide as he could. He shot out his long, sticky tongue right toward the baby bird. Well, the mother bird, she screamed, "Get out of the water! Get out of the water! Run, run, run! Run for your lives!" All the baby birds turned to flap their wings to run to get into the safety of the grass. But the baby chick, the youngest of the brothers and sisters, who had to go in the deepest, just as he turned to flap his wings to run, the frog shot out his long, sticky tongue right toward the baby bird. The baby bird, he flapped, but the big frog, he wrapped his long sticky tongue in the tail feathers of that baby bird, and then the big frog began to pull on his tongue. And when the big frog pulled on his tongue, he began to pull the baby backwards through the water. The mother bird hollered, flap your wings, harder, harder. But the baby bird was not listening to his mother. He kept looking over his shoulder. All he could see was the great big eyes of the frog, and the baby bird. The mother bird pleaded, flap your wings, harder, harder. The baby bird looked over his shoulder. He could see the big eyes of the frog with the frog's mouth wide open. The big frog knew he had this baby chick. That big frog pulled on his tongue. And the mother bird pleaded, flap your wings harder. Just then the baby bird flapped his wings as hard as he could. And when he did, his tail feathers popped out, and the baby bird sailed in to the safety of the grass. But the big frog, who had his mouth wide open, all he got was a big mouthful of tail feathers, and they stuck to his wet head. And the big frog began to and the little frog, who had been watching all of this, he said quietly to himself, that's the strangest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. And then when the big frog spit out one last big mouthful of tail feathers, the baby frog, to be polite, he said, excuse me, when I get big like you, is that how I'm supposed to catch birds? And the big frog said, no! And then the big frog turned and swam away. Well, the little frog looked up. He saw one little tail feather floating down toward the surface of the pond. So the little frog, he opened up his froggy mouth. He shot out his long sticky tongue. He caught that tail feather in the air with his tongue. He pulled it into his mouth, and he tasted it. And then he swallowed it. And he said, doesn't taste so bad. What's the fuss? And then the two frogs swam away. And I went down to the pond that afternoon, and I met those two frogs, and they told me that story so I could share it with you. Thank you.